a strike that shattered Putin's sense of security. Something unusual was developing across the battlefields of Eastern Europe. The pattern military analysts had grown used to tracking steady Ukrainian attacks on Russian supply depots, fuel storage sites, and tactical command centers had suddenly disappeared. There were no announcements, no official briefings, only an uneasy silence that caught the attention of veteran intelligence professionals. Those with years of experience monitoring conflict zones understand what silence often signals. It is rarely calm. It usually comes just before something unexpected occurs. Intelligence analysts in Washington and London began to notice familiar warning signs. Ukrainian long-range systems were shifting into forward positions. Secure military communications increased sharply. Reconnaissance activity appeared along routes that had seen no movement for months. Most telling of all was the complete lack of public confirmation of successful operations. 3 days before the event, internal alerts circulated within Western intelligence circles. A major action was being prepared. The target was unclear. The timing was uncertain, but the conclusion was firm. When Ukraine ended its silence, the impact would be impossible to ignore. Few anticipated how decisive that moment would be. The morning everything changed. Air defense networks across southern Russia activated before sunrise. Multiple airborne objects were detected approaching from the southwest. These did not match the familiar drone profiles Russian operators had learned to recognize over the past 18 months. These were specialized platforms, the type Ukraine deploys only for missions of exceptional significance. Russian military bloggers reported the activity first, followed by confused residents near Sochi, describing distant blasts. Then, satellite analysts observed something that caused intelligence briefings worldwide to pause. Smoke was rising from a coastal compound believed to be beyond reach. Putin's private Black Sea residence, the lavish palace revealed years earlier by opposition investigators, had been struck. These were not symbolic near misses meant to send a message. They were direct hits, multiple impacts on the main complex, its security perimeter, and supporting infrastructure. This was not a military warehouse or supply facility. It was the Russian president's personal retreat, a physical symbol of authority and presumed immunity. Ukrainian forces had demonstrated they could reach it with precision, bypassing what were considered some of the most advanced air defense systems available. Attention immediately turned to the Kremlin's response to an attack that crossed long-standing unspoken limits. Russia brought the war to our homes. Within hours, the strike that changed everything, President Vladimir Zelensky appeared before the cameras. His words were notable for their clarity. There was no diplomatic caution, no carefully framed language to preserve ambiguity, only a direct statement. Russia brought this war to our homes. Now they understand what that feels like. This marked a clear break from Ukraine's usual approach. Traditionally, Kyiv maintains strategic ambiguity regarding strikes deep inside Russian territory, allowing speculation while avoiding direct confirmation. This time was different. The acknowledgement itself became a strategic message, aimed not only at Russia but also at the broader international audience. The message was simple: we carried this out intentionally. What followed revealed something even more concerning for Moscow than the boldness of the target itself: the level of operational sophistication involved. Ukrainian drones were not launched blindly in hopes that some might get through. The strike was executed with such precision that Russian air defense systems failed to intercept a single aircraft. This is significant. Russia has spent billions strengthening air defenses around high V-value locations in the southern region, including layered radar coverage, advanced interceptors, and constant readiness. Yet Ukrainian planners identified weaknesses in that system and exploited them with precision. This degree of planning points to intelligence capabilities that extend beyond satellite imagery or intercepted signals. Ukrainian forces appeared to know exactly when defenses would be weakest, which routes would avoid detection, and how to synchronize multiple drones to overwhelm remaining defenses. Russian planners now face a troubling conclusion. If Ukraine can fully map and defeat defensive networks protecting one sensitive site, it may be able to do so elsewhere. The consequences go far beyond damage to a single location. The strike on the palace was not a standalone event. It was part of a broader coordinated operation carried out across multiple domains at the same time. Ukrainian special forces conducted reconnaissance along the Russian border, prompting the redeployment of units away from key frontline areas. Cyber teams targeted Russian communications systems that had been upgraded only days earlier. Naval drones operating in the Black Sea reportedly damaged or destroyed patrol vessels assigned to protect coastal installations. This was not a symbolic action or an opportunistic strike. It represented a form of strategic decapitation designed to show that Ukraine possesses not only long-range strike capability, but also the intelligence, coordination, and operational capacity to conduct complex multi-domain actions deep inside Russian territory. Each element served a specific role. The border reconnaissance forced Russian units to spread out, reducing force concentration at critical points along the front. The cyber attacks reduced Moscow's ability to coordinate defensive responses. The naval strikes removed assets that would have defended against precisely this type of coastal operation. Ukrainian military planners carried out a textbook special operations campaign demonstrating capabilities that many Western analysts did not believe had reached this level of maturity. Moscow's reaction followed quickly, though not in the form many anticipated. Instead of immediate military retaliation, the Kremlin released statements marked by unusual urgency and anger. Several spokespeople described the strike as terrorism against the Russian state, an assault on the president's personal security, and an act that would lead to consequences beyond imagination. One phrase was repeated across Russian state media within hours: total annihilation. These were not vague warnings about escalation or references to red lines, but a specific claim that Ukraine's leadership, government facilities, and critical infrastructure would face complete destruction. The language was deliberate, intended to frighten Ukrainian civilians, pressure Western backers, and reassure domestic audiences that attacks on the president's security would not be tolerated. But threats are only effective if the opponent hesitates, and Ukraine showed no indication of retreat. The intensity of Moscow's response revealed Kyiv sought to observe whether Putin would respond with immediate force or rely on rhetoric while preparing a more calculated reply. The result fell between these two options. Russia did not launch instant retaliatory strikes, but it did organize a coordinated response across several domains that even Ukrainian planners noted. Activity increased near nuclear storage facilities, though officials emphasized this appeared precautionary rather than preparatory. Coordinated cyber operations targeted Ukrainian government portals and financial systems. Artillery attacks on civilian infrastructure intensified across multiple cities. All of this occurred within the same 12-hour period, indicating centralized direction rather than isolated actions. When Russia moves multiple instruments at once, it signals a broader shift underway, one that goes beyond immediate retaliation and points to a deeper strategic adjustment. Ukraine has also altered the psychological balance of the conflict. For months, Russia projected itself as an unstoppable force, gradually wearing down Ukrainian resistance. Now Russians are confronting a different question. If Ukraine can strike the president's residence, what else is within reach? That uncertainty erodes confidence more effectively than territorial losses. Putin now faces increasing pressure from competing groups within his own system, each calling for a different course of action. Military hardliners demand swift and overwhelming retaliation to restore deterrence. Economic advisors push for de-escalation in order to ease Western sanctions that continue to damage key sectors of the economy. Intelligence officials want time to determine how Ukraine was able to penetrate Russian defenses so completely. Political allies are urging Putin to project strength without provoking a wider conflict that could threaten his domestic stability. Managing these competing pressures while facing a Ukrainian military that has demonstrated it can strike anywhere creates an extremely risky decision-making environment. Leaders under this kind of strain often act not from confidence, but from insecurity and fear. The hypocrisy of Russian outrage is difficult to ignore. Kremlin statements broadcast across state media describe the strike as a violation of the rules of war and an act of terrorism against the Russian state. This framing is significant because it attempts to reclassify a military operation as a criminal act in the eyes of the international community. However, this narrative faces immediate credibility challenges. For months, Russia has deliberately targeted Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, power stations, water systems, heating facilities with the clear aim of creating humanitarian crises, particularly during winter. Russian missiles have struck apartment buildings, shopping centers, hospitals, and schools, often with the explicit intent to intimidate civilian populations. After establishing this pattern of civilian targeting, Russia now claims outrage that Ukraine struck a palace belonging to the leader who authorized those attacks. The contradiction is so clear that even countries generally sympathetic to Moscow struggle to support this characterization. Ukraine's response reinforced this point. Zelensky stated that Ukrainian forces targeted a site of military relevance used by the commander-in-chief of Russian forces, not civilian housing. The palace serves operational functions linked to command authority and strategic coordination, making it a legitimate military target. There is no palace, bunker, or fortress where those responsible for these actions can escape accountability. These remarks were not aimed solely at domestic audiences. They functioned as strategic communication directed at several groups at once. To Ukrainians, the message was that their military remains capable and determined. To Russians, it signaled that no one, including the president, is beyond reach. To Western partners, it demonstrated that Ukraine remains a credible and effective ally, competing not only on the battlefield, but in psychological space as well. Most directly, the message to Putin was unmistakable. The consequences of his decisions cannot be avoided. Western intelligence agencies noted with concern that Russia's nuclear forces reportedly increased their readiness level after the strike. Though officials emphasized this appeared precautionary rather than preparatory, the difference is critical. Precautionary steps maintain readiness without intent to act, while preparatory actions indicate possible use. Current assessments lean toward the former. Still, any adjustment in nuclear posture is taken seriously, as such signals are closely monitored by intelligence services worldwide. NATO has made clear through multiple channels that any use of nuclear weapons by Russia would provoke responses that would fundamentally alter Moscow's strategic position. While the exact nature of those responses remains intentionally vague, the commitment to respond is not. Russia understands that crossing the nuclear threshold would eliminate any remaining international tolerance for its actions and could invite direct Western military involvement. Ukraine's strike appears to have been carefully calibrated to avoid creating justification for nuclear escalation. It did not target nuclear facilities, population centers, or civilians. Instead, it struck a symbol of power-damaging Putin's prestige without presenting a credible existential threat that could be used to justify nuclear retaliation. Pentagon officials are now tracking Russian military movements with a level of scrutiny not seen since the opening weeks of the war. Intelligence intercepts suggest confusion within the Russian military, not only over the extent of the damage, but more importantly, over how Ukrainian forces managed to bypass defenses so thoroughly. That uncertainty itself carries strategic weight. When a military cannot explain how an attack succeeded, it cannot be confident it can prevent the next one. Russian commanders must now assume that any facility in Western Russia could be targeted with similar precision. That assumption forces the dispersal of defensive resources, ties down forces in protective roles, and creates psychological strain that reduces operational efficiency. Western analysts assess that Russia's extreme public threats are likely part of a psychological warfare strategy, aimed at fracturing Western unity and undermining Ukrainian morale. The calculation is straightforward. If threats of total annihilation prompt Western countries to pressure Ukraine into negotiations or reduce support, the threats achieve strategic goals regardless of Moscow's intent. But this strategy depends on Ukraine yielding or Western resolve weakening. Neither is occurring. The intelligence question dominates discussions worldwide. How did Ukraine acquire the information necessary to carry out the strike so precisely? The operation required detailed knowledge of Putin's schedule. The most effective campaigns integrate multiple forms of intelligence into comprehensive operational pictures that enable precise targeting. What is clear is that Ukraine either possesses indigenous intelligence capabilities far more advanced than previously understood, or it benefits from Western support that extends into operational planning beyond public acknowledgement, or both. Any of these possibilities is concerning for Moscow. Russia's response within 12 hours, elevating nuclear posture, conducting cyber attacks, and intensifying bombardments demonstrates that Moscow understands the stakes and is attempting to restore deterrence through multi-domain escalation. However, this approach carries risks. Every escalatory move gives Western nations reason to increase support for Ukraine. Attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure strengthen international resolve, and empty nuclear threats reduce the credibility of future warnings. Russia is climbing an escalation ladder that offers no clear advantage. The next 48 to 72 hours will reveal whether these threats result in tangible military action or remain primarily rhetorical. If Moscow responds with proportional conventional strikes against Ukrainian government targets, the conflict continues along its current trajectory with heightened intensity. If it attempts disproportionate escalation, it risks triggering Western responses that could fundamentally alter its strategic position. Ukraine has shown it is willing to accept the risks of this moment. It calculated that striking Putin's palace would produce psychological effects worth the potential retaliation. This assumes either that Russian retaliation will be constrained by fear of